Welcome to this talk. Welcome Nahid Shahalimi. Welcome Mariam Safi. Welcome to this book launch on this rather chilly December morning. I would like to introduce Nahid Shahalimi, editor and contributor to this book. She was born in Afghanistan, fled the country when she was a young girl together with her mother and sisters, and began a new life first in Canada and then in Germany. She works as an artist, author and filmmaker, and she majored in fine arts, politics and Southeast Asian studies with a specialization in human rights in Montreal, Canada. She started traveling to Kabul and remote rural places in 2011 in order to interview Afghan women, often at the risk of her life and the risk of her interview partners. The stories were published in 2017 in a highly praised book under the title Where Courage Bears the Soul. We Are Still Here is her second book. I would like to introduce you to Mariam Safi, who was born in Kabul, fled the country when she was 5. She also grew up in Canada. She studied political and peace studies. In 2007, she went back to Kabul to work for a think tank. And in 2014, she founded the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, DROPS. We will surely hear more about your involvements shortly. Her research and analytical findings in state building and conflict management were published in numerous books and articles for international think tanks, including security-related magazines and online publications with peace-building and humanitarian NGOs. She was engaged with NATO, European Union and UN and scientific institutions worldwide. She was also part of the 2016 delegation meeting with the Taliban officials in Qatar. So in short, she's a true expert. Allow me to talk briefly about why we decided to publish this book. In August 15th this year, it was a day of shock, horror, frustration, anger, and despair. And after a few days, we decided to transform our powerlessness into something positive. I'm a publisher, and women's issues are one of our key interests. We who work in publishing and in media need to talk about the needs of Afghan women, Afghan girls and women, so that the international community will not forget the humanitarian disaster. So our idea was to ask Afghan women to raise their voices by writing their stories. We all worked day and night to make this happen now. We did not want to lose any time. We wanted to publish this book as quickly as possible. Nahid will be telling more about the women who contributed a little later. We asked Margaret Atwood to write a foreword, and she agreed. We sent files to the printer in late October, and we had finished books a couple of weeks later. Nahid has been on TV, radio, and gave numerous interviews, with the result that after only 1 week, we are almost sold out. We need to reprint. So this is a success story. We will now be seeing Nahid's film that she produced while we were also producing the book.
How do you see the role of women? What are we going to do if that peace process is signed at the cost of women?
Afghanistan has witnessed great progress since 2001. This is reflected in the emergence of a bright and vibrant new generation of youth, the representation of women in all sectors of Afghan society, and the strengthening of a promising democratic system of governance. There was a perception that everything before August 15th was terrific and it was rosy and there were no problems, but that's not the case.
They actually have given this to me to wear when I'm going around in Kabul or when I'm going to the set to record Afghanistan. So if you get shot, if they shoot you, and if they shoot you here, nothing will happen to you unless they shoot you in the head.
17 years ago, hope replaced despair. I believe it was 2.5 years ago. I was sitting where Ambassador O'Neill is sitting. I said to the members that the international community is relegating the voices of women to the margins, while treating the Taliban as the locals, giving them ownership of the process, while saying that women were posing as obstacles to a political settlement. It didn't go anywhere. No one heard. So I sit here again, without a home, without a country, and an end to what millions of Afghans sacrificed with their lives and their dreams. And I'm going to say to you that if engagement doesn't speak of benchmarks, it doesn't speak of tough conditions for the Taliban to put into action their words, the regression, the turmoil, and the insecurity we Afghans are facing today, they will face tomorrow. Thank you.
My appeal to you is to listen to these women, see them, see their commitment to freedom and to their rights, see them in a new light. They are not victims. They never were. They do not need regrets. Rather, they need a platform, support, and solidarity. Invite them, involve them in conversations, at events, in expert panels. There are so many experts talking about us and our country. You can get first-hand knowledge from Afghan women. Afghanistan's women have proved time and time again how strong, resourceful, resilient, and forward-looking they are. This time around, we will not be silent, for we are still here.
And I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Elisabeth Sandmann. I'm, as you have heard, the publisher of this book. And I have my first question to Nahid. 13 women have contributed to this new book. Who are these women and why did you choose them?
Thank you for the question, first of all. The women are the highly qualified Afghan female experts in their fields, in the various fields. These are just a small group of hundreds of women that are out there inside of Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan that are fully capable of speaking for themselves and speaking about the fields that they're so actively engaged in. These are also the women that have been directly involved in building this vibrant civil society of Afghanistan, which is very, and I say this sadly, unfortunately, that the international media did not show as often as they should have. Yes, it was a small, how do you say it? It was a small piece of progress, but it was a highly important piece of progress because due to this group of women, they were able to achieve so much in Afghanistan, which was also not often portrayed in the West, in the international media. And that was the reason why we decided to do the 2017 book as well, to show the other side of the coin, because we do have inspirational Afghan women that have done so many things, break taboos, name it, all of these. And to name a few, incredible women like Fawzi Kofi, who's an excellent politician, a peace negotiator, to Roya Sadat, who is basically the legendary filmmaker at such a young age, to Ariana Saeed, who broke taboos in spite of all of the death threats, the daily bullying of social medias and everything. She broke a lot of taboos for the younger generations of the female musicians, Afghan female musicians, or Fatima Husseini, who decided to photograph and show the culture, the beauty of the Afghan culture through hats, through archaeological sites, through clothing, beauty amidst war, to Mariam Safi, who is the expert in her field, female or male, of that region. So it was extremely important to let these, to have the women speak themselves. We can speak ourselves. We don't need somebody else to speak for us. We have a lot of experts speaking about us, but it is about time that we listen to the Afghan female experts.
Well, if there was still doubt, there is now the possibility to read this book. Mariam, through your work and that of your organization Drops in Afghanistan, can you tell us a bit about the kind of advocacy that was done within the community around women's rights and mobilization, and what needs to be done now to ensure this continues?
Thank you for your question. One of the greatest achievements of the post-2001 era in Afghanistan was the creation of a very vibrant civil society, freedom of speech, journalists, and almost in every sector. Within these, the progress that women made was quite great. And in particular, when it came to advocacy around women's rights,
women activists, women-led NGOs, women's networks were forward in their thinking, and they were forward in carving a path to ensure that the gains made post 2001 were sustainable. And in particular, in the last few years, especially as the peace process emerged in the country, what we saw was something quite remarkable. We saw an almost organic women's movement emerge. Now, women, just like every other demographic, has different opinions about different things. However, the women were able to come together in Afghanistan and agree on a few broad strokes, such as the protection of the constitution and within that their rights. In terms of preserving the gains of the last 20 years, which means women's status in the public sphere, in terms of human rights. And women actually in Afghanistan were the first group to emerge to protect these gains, and they were the most active than any other. And it was not just women's rights, it was actually them fighting for human rights in the country. And we saw things like, we saw op-eds were produced continuously, international conferences where they advocated, within the country, sitting with international communities, sitting with the communities, discussing what was being debated on the table. We saw a lot of social media activity, such as, for example, the My Red Lines campaign that had emerged and swept across the nation. Within that process, there were some narratives emerging that the women's movement was largely based in city centers like Kabul. Now that, in one regards, is a very important point to highlight, and it was one that we at Drops took notice of, and we realized that we have to make sure that more voices from the provinces also get to the negotiation table. Gender segregated data is crucial in ensuring that the experiences of women in all parts of the country are represented. And for that, we created an initiative called Bishnow, which means listen. And we used the 3 methodological tools that we had digitalized to allow us to gather hundreds, at times thousands, of women's voices in 16 provinces. We asked them questions from the exchange of prisoners to the withdrawal of US forces to the preconditions that were being set, an array of topics. And we gathered these perspectives and then we fed it into the negotiation table to the women negotiators first, and then to the international community, to the Afghan government, and all stakeholders. In July, a couple of weeks before Kabul and Afghanistan fell, we had conducted a survey with 3,480 women in 16 provinces. And at this time, we had asked women what were the conditions for women in districts that had recently fallen to the Taliban. Our findings were quite spectacular in the sense that it predicted to us what we saw happen to women after August. For instance, we asked women in these 16 provinces if the Taliban had changed their views on women's rights. And 86% said that the Taliban had not changed their repressive pre-2001 position on women's rights. 65% said that the quality of life for women in districts that had recently fallen to the Taliban were very poor. 69% said that the conditions for women in these districts had changed. And how they had changed? Well, women couldn't travel alone anymore. They were banned from traveling alone. They were forced to wear a burqa, for instance. Girls' high schools were closed. And these are all things you saw happen after August. And now, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, another form of advocacy emerged, both within Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan. Within Afghanistan, you saw young women, while staring down the barrel of a gun, going onto the streets and protesting for their rights. That showed the Taliban that the Afghanistan you had left in 2001 is not the Afghanistan you are returning to. And that was quite remarkable. And they're still doing it. They're still going onto the streets and they're protesting for those rights. Outside of Afghanistan, As you recall, there was a massive evacuation, and a lot of the women civil society activists, journalists were able to leave, while many still remain in Afghanistan. Those that had left have started an advocacy with international stakeholders, such as the UN and other agencies, reminding them that conditions must be set for any recognition of the Taliban, reminding them that when international figures are visiting the Taliban, to ensure they have women in their delegation, which was not happening in September, but it's happening now due to that type of advocacy. And they're also creating mechanisms through which they can bridge the women that are now in Afghanistan and the Afghan women now that have left Afghanistan, because they're going to have to work together to be able to face the challenges that will come their way and have already come their way.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's so important to have these findings, to have the analysis, so that whenever you publish or whenever you say something, it is based on facts. We will hear later why, it's one of the questions, why did the UN and other institutions not listen to you? And why was this not heard? And why was this not clear enough that what would happen when the Taliban takes over? My question now, Nahid, is when you published the first book and you were traveling in 2017 to Afghanistan, it was a different country. It was a country of hope. And you met girls and women who were doing, for the first time, sports. They played music, or they followed up on their interest. I remember that I've seen a film when they were so happy to skate or to cycle or to play the guitar. So what was your experience and what has happened to these women and girls?
The sports, the music, the culture, the book, the freedoms that they had, these were the means to that freedom. And I think that as a human, now the artist in me would say that you can't breathe if you don't do art. You can't breathe as an ex-professional sportswoman myself. If you take those things away from a person, regardless of female or male, you are completely, literally suffocating that person. That is one thing. But for these girls that I met, whether it was the conductors, whether it was the artists, the street artists, or the musicians, for example, they saw that those moments amidst this horrific war. Let's not forget that Afghanistan was still in war before 15th of August, as most of us know. This presumption that it was all okay, it wasn't. In spite of all of these difficulties and obstacles, these girls were able to achieve like truly incredible things, and with no means. But that was a vessel for them to reach that freedom that they were seeking for. And I think that through that, there was often, whenever I did the readings or the conferences for that book, and even for this one that has started now, is that how do you get to that point where, in spite of the wars, in spite of the obstacles, where it started at home, so they had to fight with their families first to go to those things, and then they were on the streets, and sometimes they would be spat at because they had a ball in their hands, and they would go and play football. And then by the time they would get to the stadiums in order to do the trainings, often the stadium time was given to the men because they were not important enough. They would have to do the whole trek back. This is a daily thing. It didn't happen once. It happened every single week for years and years. And still, they had that big smile on their face. And they said that if I was to live in free spirit for 2 hours once a week, then it is worth it. And that is simply another level of strength, which I don't think anybody really realizes. A lot of people realize it probably because of what happened, on the 15th. But to go and complete the question, where are they? A lot of them are out. Many of them are still in Afghanistan, and many of them, the ones especially that are well known, are in hiding. But as I have to say, chime into what Mariam said just a few minutes ago, is that it is because of women like, one of our women, Razia, who goes on the streets and protests and organizes these protests, that these voices will stay alive. Even if it's this much hope, there is hope.
Mariam, you have engaged with the Taliban in the past. Why do they not seem to see the interdependence between education of girls and women and the prosperity of a country? Why not allow schools or university education for women?
If I were to answer that simply, I believe from what we have seen from the Taliban after August, they simply do not believe in equal rights for boys and girls. That's what I think is the reality. Because the actions they took in first closing all schools, then very recently opening schools for boys, but keeping them shut for girls, saying that they're going to release decrees on how that will look like, banning women from working, from entering the public sphere, saying that women can no longer work in politics, and they can't be employed as deputy ministers, administrators, decision making circles when it comes to policy and policy formulation on national issues. That shows to us clearly that their prescription of women's role in society is one that is completely unequal.
And you also have some data, I think, on what kind of impact it has if we exclude, or if this country excludes, girls and women from working or from education.
Absolutely. Very, very recently, I think in early December, UNDP released a report that was quite shocking. And in that report, they stated that by banning women from entering the workforce, prior to August, 20% of the workforce was by women. And by banning women from entering the workforce, they're expecting a fall in the GDP of about $1 billion, or about 5% of the GDP in the country. Now that's quite significant, and that's quite significant because the international community supposes that it's going to take an immediate $2 billion to lift those that are at the brink of starvation, and about $6 to $8 billion annually to fund basic services. Now, by continuing to eliminate women from the workforce, while being in a situation where the Taliban are consistently lamenting about the fall of the economy and the deterioration that they're facing, so why not allow women to continue to work? And one of the data points that report had highlighted, which is really important to note here, is that about the economic impact of educating girls. They had stated in the report that the economic impact of educating a girl is double that than educating a boy. So the correlation is very much there. But one of the reasons why is their prescription of women's role in society based on their strict interpretation of Sharia. Let's not forget that what we lived in before August was an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. The constitution of Afghanistan does not go against Islamic principles. Until date, the Taliban have not yet made clear what their description is.
Well, these are shocking figures, I must say, and especially when we look at the improvements that were made during these past 20 years for girls and women. Can you both tell us a little bit about the improvements that were seen worldwide?
I think when it comes to numbers, any number that you would take from 2001 and compare it to, let's say, 15th August of 2021 would be remarkable. What the society and when the women achieved, and I, to be honest, I hate to use that word achieved. I don't want to use it because I do hope, and I think that we can still salvage. There's still some hope to salvage some of the gains of the 20 years, especially when it comes to women and minorities, because there's a lot of minorities that are being also, slapped. The gains of this country is, for me as an Afghan, to see what they have done. I'm still always in shock to say in every corner of the country that I have visited, and I'm sure that Mariam would agree with this as well, that behind every stone you see improvement in every sector. Yes, the war stopped a lot of what we did. Often we went 2 steps forward and then we were pushed back 3 steps, but it kept on going. The data kept on going up. The education, for example, for women were never so educated, and the opportunities that they got through the international communities help as well, because there were lots of programs that were built for Afghan women specifically, so that they were pushed into these programs to educate themselves and then come back. Fresh Tafaro, for example, one of our women in the book, she got scholarships to Berlin, to Germany, and did her master's degree in Germany after having her bachelor's degree in Herat University. But she decided not to stay outside. She could have, but she came back with that knowledge and produced the first coding school for Afghanistan. There's some hundreds of young girls that are coding, that are developers, and one of them is just that. There's so many examples to give, and I think it is also extremely important to know that all of them have been under the Islamic rule or the Islamic constitution that has been. It's really important to know that we do not need the Taliban to bring Islam into the country, but at the same time, we did not learn democracy and feminism from the West either. We had ministers that were women way before many Western countries in the world. And these are really some fact-checking that people have to do before putting any kind of stamp onto the Afghan women or Afghans in general. That is very, very important.
Well, I think it was very impressive also to read the stories and to hear filmmakers, journalists, the first women in your first book who opened an internet cafe, or, all these developments happened, and there was just so much enthusiasm and hope. And I was also impressed how women wanted to educate themselves, how they struggled to get the best education possible. They spoke good English, they wanted to travel. There was just so much enthusiasm to change their lives for the better of their nation. And also a lot of these women in the book, they were born in Afghanistan, they went back to Afghanistan in order to do something for the country. Now they have all fled. They have left. Some are still on the road, as you say, or some are in hiding. Some need to change places every day. As we all know, it was impossible. It was a big failure of the Americans and the Allies to bring out as many people as possible. That brings me to a question to you, Mariam. What was your experience when you talked at the UN General Assembly in 2019? Was your voice heard then? Or can you tell us briefly what you said at the time in 2019?
In 2019, a year of the peace process wasn't much of a process, though. In talks that were led by the United States with the Taliban, a year had passed by, and we were very concerned. We were very concerned because the voices of Afghans didn't have a space in these talks. The aspirations, the fears, and the concerns of Afghans from all ethnic groups, from women, from youth and other vulnerable groups were not were not represented. And we saw this as a process that wanted to create a responsible withdrawal for the United States and its allies. And within this responsible withdrawal, we asked, well, where will Afghans be left in this process? See, Afghans didn't want the US and allies to have a military footprint in Afghanistan forever. No one wants another nation's military footprint in their country. And Afghans didn't want that either. They knew that this had to come to an end. What they had suggested and what they were advocating for was to do this in a manner that would actually be responsible, meaning not leaving Afghans in the middle of a complete and utter disaster, and not giving all of the power or the local ownership to the Taliban, which is what I highlighted at the General Assembly. We had noticed consistently that the international community was saying that the Taliban have changed. And we were saying, no, I don't see anything on the ground that shows that they have changed. So they were saying that the Taliban have changed. They're not the Taliban of 96 till 2001.
Who said that? Who said the Taliban had changed?
The international community as a whole. And there were like-minded thinkers also in Afghanistan that the Taliban had changed. And mind you, the Taliban were saying the right things at that time. But we were saying that unless they put action to their words, how can you believe that, yes, they have changed? Isn't that a bit too risky? And I went to the UN General Assembly and I told them that they were sidelining the voices of women. They were treating women as spoilers, in fact, because they were saying that women were against peace and that women were not that women were, their advocacy was continuing the bloodshed in Afghanistan, while what women were fighting for was sustainability of this so-called peace talks, which obviously now you see where we are. This is the fear that women had at that time. And the Taliban were being treated as the locals, meaning they were being treated as those representing the views of Afghans. A narrative had emerged in 2019 when the women's movement became so strong that I hinted at in in my previous response, was that the women's voices are elite. They're in Kabul. The women in Kabul don't represent the majority of the population that are in the provinces. Their voices, what did their voices say? And so these types of narratives that kept on emerging was eroding at the women's movement in the peace process. And I believe that the international community, from what I witnessed, had a large role to play in this process. They were war weary. They wanted to leave. They wanted to leave Afghanistan, and they needed a way to leave. And this would have given them that exit. I don't think that perhaps anyone anticipated what this would ultimately create for the people of Afghanistan, also the security of the region and the security of the international community. In Afghanistan, since August, you have seen repeated attacks by ISIS and other international terrorist organizations, which the Taliban had said that they would be able to, of course, break links with and fight and curb. But we haven't seen that happen. We continue to see the killing of ethnic groups, particularly the Hazara community, across the country and in Kabul, with repeated attacks on them. And so the promises of the Taliban with regards to women's rights and inclusive government, which they have not met, let's put that to the side. Security, which is something that they had said and something that the international community would repeat to us in meetings in Kabul, that they would be able to ensure security of Afghanistan, that they would be able to, that they're better suited than the Afghan National Security Forces in fighting these terrorist organizations. Well, where is that? So we haven't seen it yet. And so that was my concern, and that's what I voiced to them. But no one listened. No one listened. And I was only one, that was one meeting. Hundreds of women from Afghanistan have repeatedly told the international community over the course of 2018 till 2020, telling them that we are headed towards catastrophe, giving recommendations, concrete recommendations, even compromises on certain issues. But I think that the war weariness had set in, and they wanted to leave the country. And though Afghans didn't want international footprint forever in Afghanistan, all we had asked for was a little bit more time, so we could try to solidify these gains to an extent where, if even the Taliban did come through a political settlement with the Afghan government, we wouldn't jeopardize them to the extent that we see now. That is what we had asked for, was just a little bit more time to do that. Because from 2001 till now, the international community has made a lot of mistakes which have made these gains unsustainable, including, of course, the various administrations within Afghanistan.
Were there any women involved, within the international community? What I don't understand, it's so incomprehensible to see that no Afghan women were allowed on these peace talks, and that the international community did not protest in a way that to prevent peace talks to happen without a majority of women, or an equal number of women at least.
Yes, you're right. We had only 4 women in the negotiation team.
And only
4 women out of...
It was 4 women out of roughly 22.
But how come this was possible? How come this was accepted? Why weren't there no protests of the international community? I find it so hard to understand.
There were certain members of the international community in Kabul, and at one point in Kabul, we had a large group of women diplomats heading their missions, particularly from Europe, and they were fighting for those rights. They were fighting for those rights. However, the international community, particularly the United States, had set the benchmark so low by continuously, repeatedly eroding the importance of women's rights. I remember at that time, the key was, let's bring the Taliban to the negotiation table to agree to a ceasefire. That should be priority. If we bring women's rights and human rights into the debate, it's going to take longer to get to that. Let's have a ceasefire, then we can talk about these issues. While we can understand the logic, let's save lives. Saving lives is extremely important. We feared that if you did that, the Taliban, because they had not changed, will not negotiate women's rights and human rights with you. And this is what we see now happening. And so I think that the diplomatic missions within Kabul were also under pressure from their states, from their governments, ultimately. See, when the US left Afghanistan, NATO allies also had to pack up and leave. They simply could not logistically support themselves in Afghanistan without the facilities that were provided by the United States. And therefore, it all kind of fell as a sort of a domino effect thereafter. The international community was never really on the same page, but ultimately their withdrawal, whether some were hesitant to withdraw, and I think the EU was hesitant to withdraw, they were left with no choice.
So if we look at the future now, or at the present situation, how can the specific needs of women be addressed?
Currently?
Yeah.
At the present moment, we are faced with a humanitarian catastrophe. Humanitarian aid agencies believe that this is going to be the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history. About 97% of the country lives below the poverty line. And at this particular juncture, the focus is to make sure that humanitarian assistance it gets to the people of Afghanistan, and particularly women. So women who are advocating, doing advocacy outside, are advocating to ensure that women are part of the design and implementation of any humanitarian assistance. They are trying to ensure that the humanitarian assistance, that it not only remains as humanitarian assistance, because then we're going to go back to pre-2001. We have to make sure that development aid also is able to get into the country through civil society organizations that are still operating in the country, for instance, and INGOs who can continue to provide capacity building and other programming to ensure that we preserve the gains. But also in this regards, we have to make sure that the international community uses its leverage and retains pressure on the Taliban for any potential future recognition to be linked to respect for women's rights and respect for human rights, the development of an inclusive government, for example, and cutting of links with terrorist organizations. So these need to be the conditions for any recognition that may happen in the future of the Taliban. The Taliban at the present moment are looking for two things. Two things is what they want. One, they want international recognition. That means the unfreezing of Afghanistan's assets. And the second is economic aid. Like I mentioned, about $68 billion is what the country continues to require. Afghanistan was and still is an aid-dependent country. And so we have to make sure that conditions are there. But also for the humanitarian assistance to get into Afghanistan, we have to make sure that there's not conditions, but there are benchmarks set to that. And that none of that aid should go to the Taliban, them having not proven to meet any of their commitments, and that it goes towards aid agencies that can still meet the needs of, for example, teachers, nurses, and others in the community without having to have that channeled through the Taliban de facto authority. So at the present moment, this is the focus. We have to maintain the advocacy. We have to continue to give women who are in Afghanistan the platform to speak of what they are seeing and what they are experiencing. And we have to build bridges between the women there and the women that are outside of the country to ensure that that advocacy remains strong.
Nahid, what is your position? What can be done for the women right now, and what is done, maybe behind the scenes?
I think I don't want to repeat what Mariam said. Everything that she said, I agree fully with. The one thing that I think is very, very important is to give the narrative back, or rather have the women of Afghanistan speak for themselves. Let these spaces, platforms be filled with the Afghan women when it's about Afghanistan. We see a lot of platforms, a lot of spaces that are having panels and everything. There's about 5 people, 4 of them are foreigners, 1 of them is an Afghan. It should be the other way around. And I think it is extremely important that this narrative be informed, as you mentioned also, that this narrative has to be informed by the Afghans, by Afghan women especially, because these are the first-hand experts. We don't want a second-hand information. And the authentic tone that they have is extremely important. As Mariam is speaking, nobody else could speak that way. And because, what bothers me is that as much as we have been advocating, and I'm really happy that it's starting to move a little bit towards that, and this book is one example of it, is to take these spaces and give it back to the Afghans, because it's as we have said so often today, even the Afghan woman of 20 years ago is no longer the same. The girls that are 20 years and 30 years old, and they're running basically a lot of these civil society organizations, they have only heard of the Taliban from papers, from videos. They don't even know. They have read about them. This is not the same. These girls have grown up in a completely different setting, and in order to help the Afghans from this side of the world, let's say, is whenever you get the opportunities, to the publishers, to the filmmakers, give these spaces to the Afghan females who can do that. You know, we have so many journalists. Some, I'm not saying all, some are there and posting things and again stamping this narrative onto the Afghans as a whole. And for 3 weeks you go there and you try to write a book or you try to make a film. That is not what Afghanistan is about. This narrative is not the complete narrative. It's just another thing that they want to control, or try to control, rather, to show just this one part of the world when it comes to Afghanistan. To my surprise, I found out this year that we were the only ones in Germany that had a book that did portraits of many different Afghans, biographical, and this is the second one. There is absolutely none. So how can we change all of these things? This is in our control. Help, I mean, you can help. There's so many NGOs that are also active. There's lots of institutions, all female institutions, that are active on the ground. Of course, a lot of them are in a hush-hush mode, but we do have projects that are running. They're very tiny, but they're very successful. So instead of posting and saying like, oh, an exclusive interview with Shaheen or the leaders of the Taliban, which is not exclusive. They have been in Doha for very, very many years. You know, you could have gone anytime. Please make sure that whenever you get the opportunity, be ethical and very professional in your job. That is what we ask for. But that is what I ask for. And I will be advocating for that from now on as well. And I will be trying to make these bridges with the Afghans that are on the ground, which we do have on a daily basis or weekly basis. We are in touch with them. And we will take it one day at a time. And it's a fight. And it's going to be a very, very, very tough fight. But I think that we're going to be able to do it only together. Solidarity does not mean that you take the identity and the cultural identity of a country and control it. That is not solidarity. Solidarity is that you have everybody's back so that they do their job.
So there are a lot of other issues that we have not touched, but there is still room for discussion. And if you need background information or very moving stories, then we can only recommend this book. We mentioned at the beginning that the foreword was written by Margaret Atwood. And I would like to quote at the end of this panel what she wrote. She wrote, "A country without any women at all cannot exist for long. No matter how much a regime may hate and punish women, it can't do without them entirely. But what sort of women we shall see." Margaret Atwood. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.